Oh, the schoolboy always, which for me was always, it helped me. I could hop on stage and it gives me a bit of confidence.
Angus Young is not significantly taller. He doesn't give more than his own instrument, backstage statements that are tearful never try to turn into a representation and has little altered in over half a century. Still in the schoolboy uniform with the Gibson SG still in deep red thrashing while performing that timeless duck walk skipping across the stage like a child class just to make things worse, but behind the picture of that perpetual schoolboy is someone who's never really been alright. The stage is something that Angus Young fears. His hands shake each time he enters. He observed his sibling in the spotlight lose his memories and pass away. He continued to play although a dear buddy died. He's been unfairly connected to heinous murder cases, and even though the world frequently sees him, Angus is a crazy guitar player. Silently emerged as the most resilient cornerstone of acdc, a person who never even left when everyone else eventually did. This composition does not exalt the everyone is already familiar with. Back in Highway to Hell or Black tells the tale of the commonplace pieces that unexpected, even the odd times that create the authentic Angus Young. Quiet, obstinate, intensely sentimental, and devoted to the extreme of stubbornness. In 1980 upon entering the studio, acdc rushed to compose and document Back in Black. Angus Young's brother was only 25 years old. Phil Rudd was 26, bassist, and Malcolm was 27. At 30, Cliff Williams and Brian Johnson, the man who had recently taken Bon Scott's place, was the oldest at the time of his untimely death. 32 when the majority of musicians were. Angus, you're still stumbling about in bar bands. Young was bearing the burden of a collapsing mammoth. Bon Scott, the companion of brother, the only voice of acdc, had recently died during a night of intoxicated in a parked vehicle. The band didn't have time to mourn. They only had two options: disintegrate or get up and make something strong enough to endure the catastrophe. They decided to later, just as a true storm was brewing. Hurricane season was in full swing in the Bahamas, where they had made the decision to document. Wind howled at Compass Point Studios. The windows in the studio shook. Despite the ceiling leak, the riffs continued to pouring out. We essentially had nothing. First day, followed by a few days later. Angus remembered that the entire record was there. Back in Black was finished in 7 weeks when it came out. It wasn't merely a honoring Bon Scott, it was a announcement of survival. An uptick in sadness transformed into a funeral with electricity not crying, but exploding with energy. And the man's most astounding section, the person behind those timeless chords, who all of that suffering was buried in each note. Only 25 when Angus Young was born. Back in Black become famous without using virtuosity method or stirring addresses to the crowd, but via a picture that appeared. A adult man in a school is nearly ridiculous. He was head-banging in a uniform, possessed on a stage that is electrified. Few individuals are aware that the attire wasn't the outcome of any image consultant or marketing group. His concept was in the early days of acdc. Sister Margaret Young. Angus experimented with a variety of many outrageous theatrical outfits, a superhero, and none of them survived, not even a gorilla or a nurse. Overnight before Margaret said, "You always appear to be playing like a child. Why not just wear a school uniform, hooky? Stage uniform?" Angus put it on and he hasn't removed it since. What began as a family joke turned into his. It contained military armor and a man whose before each show, hands shook. Had such terrible stage fright that he had to deceive himself by pretending to be someone otherwise. "When I wear that attire, I'm a character, longer Angus, and that the character is sufficiently insane to perform on stage." For almost half a century, Angus has remained unchanged. His attire: he doesn't adhere to fashion trends, does not update his picture, he does not require smoke machines for enormous stages or just that, choreographed performances. The cherry red SG legs kicked in their outfit. Strong riff and high voltage enough to collapse the entire venue. Since Angus Young believes that repetition isn't dull, it's devotion to oneself, to one's band, as well as the unadulterated rock and roll. He decided to accompany them until the very end in a universe in which musicians swap over their guitars, such as attire, a fresh style during each trip. Check out all of Angus Young's videos. The Gibson SG was the only one I've ever had. Paint without any extra effects or limitations version only has a slender, cherry red frame that appears fused to him each time he takes a stride. I don't need 20 guitars on stage, Angus. I only require the one that knows what I'm saying. SG isn't just it is a faithful interpreter and an instrument. Between the world and his hands when Angus shudders before a guitar performance. Grounds him when words can't adequately convey it, sings for him when he feels when Bon Scott departed the band, Malcolm did too. Perished when the cries of millions of admirers below, and he just experienced loneliness. That guitar was still there under the lights. Additionally, in contrast to many other guitarists, never once did Angus attempt to play faster shred. Harder or flaunt himself with elaborate tricks. He doesn't solo for attention, but rather to lock his inner scream. He steadied himself into a material object that he can. For Angus, the Gibson SG is similar to a unflashy, unchanging claws of wild animals, but sufficiently acute to cut through time, familiar enough to get him through all storms, and sincere enough to require an answer that nobody would anticipate, that a guy who sprints like a tornado on for two, the stage head banged like crazy. A person who works straight hours is trembling each time he performs, but Angus is exactly that. Young has been there since the beginning. When acdc took the stage, Angus was aware he wasn't meant to be in the spotlight. Dislikes speaking in front of large groups of people. He finds it difficult to handle the media. He once acknowledged, "I'm not adept in striking a balance between my own world." Consequently, prior to each performance he enters a recognizable state. Anxiety that is breathless, icy hands, and a stomach knotted up as if he were about to make a mistake that cannot be undone by those around him. Glimpse of flaming Angus at the ideal moment. Young, but he's fighting on the inside to remain upright. Prior to the start of the show, he managed to get through by turning into another person every time he dons the in his school outfit. Angus changes. The man's fear of the stage has subsided. Turns into the persona he developed, a defiant, crazy misfit schoolchild. It's that daring, fearless personality. Not Angus, who roars and darts on stage, alternating between the cherry red SG playing every riff as though it were a shout. Angus looked directly into the face of terror. Does not smoke, drink, or rely on using sedatives to cope with his panic. One custom is to put on the attire, tune the instrument. He lowers his head, and most of the time, I want to run because I'm so afraid. Away, but I've figured out how to hold on to it within and convert it into power. When the first drum hits, I'm not the same person. Fear is a constant, but rather than Angus lives with it while fleeing from it. Performs with it, and above all never allows it to prevail, which is what makes Angus Young is unique. He can't stand. He stands there to get worked on stage. Since it is the only location where fear turns into music, and perhaps those everyone believes that frantic headbangs are Angus are actually the only members of the act. Retaining himself. Angus Young has never been fond of describing himself, particularly to those they go to music just to discover not only something to critique, but also less to those who claim that acdc planted messages that are violent, evil, or satanic. The Thoughts of Youth in the Late Highway to Hell was released in the 1970s. Suddenly, acdc was the focus of the movement known as Satanic Panic, criticized rock music as a tool of the devil. They were charged with disseminating malicious messages, and there were even reports that if you listened to their records in reverse, you'd discover satanic messages concealed in the. Angus responds with a wry laugh as the music plays. He said it backwards to hear a message. During one of his infrequent public statements, "Why annoyance?" it stated directly on the cover. If I were clear, it would be Highway to Hell. I would need to sketch you a map. Angus Young blunts iconic cool sarcasm and never making an effort to win over anyone. There is no moral discourse in rock and roll. It is a natural rebellion of life power. That everyone is entitled to use, no authorization is required, and similarly to how he plays the same game and dons the same uniform. Playing a guitar and shaking his head. Additionally been penning the identical lyrics for years of drinking, women, darkness, and insurrection without adornment or justifications avoidance, not because he's exalting anything negative, but he believes music is the only medium through which individuals can be truthful about their less desirable aspects. Without needing to express regret, Angus Young's communication skills have never been strong. Concerning feelings, yet if there's one thing had caused him to slip into an exceptionally long pause, that was his death. Malcolm Young, his brother, wasn't being AC/DC's co-founder, he influenced the full tone, cadence, and vibe of Angus was the lightning for the band. Malcolm was the solid on stage. A man who never played on the earth underneath it, an out-of-time riff, a man who always understood when to stop talking, and, above all, a man Angus could ever really trust because they collaborated on music in their living room in Sydney. They didn't need a lot of words, they conversed with one another. Using guitars, Malcolm was given a severe dementia diagnosis. He forgot he has composed the chords for the tunes that recognized that Angus had elevated AC/DC to the pinnacle. Was unchangeable, but he nevertheless took Malcolm leaving the studio and entering the yard, took a seat beside him and played the guitar for on several days. Malcolm didn't reply. On some days, he simply nodded. Malcolm Young, just 3 years later, died as usual. Angus didn't provide a lengthy address, he merely stated, "Mal was the AC/DC Foundation. Without Mal I wouldn't have taken any action." However, that every power-up note was filled with loss. After years, the album was released in 2020. Of AC/DC being Angus referred to it as an album for Malcolm was once like Back in Black. Said goodbye to Bon Scott, and all the way through the recording procedure an empty guitar was stored by Angus and Malcolm has no place in the studio. No one was sitting there anymore to touch it. Angus Malcolm was more than just a sibling. Was the sole one on the planet who could ensure he arrives on stage on time and in life. Following the numerous occasions he bled for his music, Angus Young picked a peaceful spot to reside somewhere other than Los Angeles, London, or a multi-million-dollar home on the beach, or an extravagant rock star home, but a modest Netherlands home where he and Ellen, his wife, has led a tranquil life. Having spent more than 40 years together, they have no kids, and they've never given an explanation. Why does Angus never appear at entertainment activities without film festivals, no fashion displays, no weddings with co-workers or medal ceremonies? He hardly vanishes. Totally isolated from the outside world when he's not performing on tour, as though he was never really a member of the public. Simply stopping by to perform, then taking a step back. He doesn't use social media accounts, rarely conduct interviews unless vitally important, doesn't use selfies, are not taken by smartphones. Provide weekly band updates, such as many contemporary artists only require a peaceful area to place his guitar. Woman by his side who is aware of his well-being, a nice cup of tea, a tiny garden, and nobody asking too many questions. Someone once inquired, "Are you content without having kids?" Angus just shrugged, I've got the band, music, and I have Ellen, Malcolm, and I don't believe I'm." Angus Young is quiet and missing something. Is the prize following a retreat, not a retreat? Screaming for rock and roll all your life. In 2023, a Sydney real estate firm destroyed a dilapidated ancient home in Burwood. Is a typical neighborhood with, for them, there are no signs or special fences. Was only $5.8 million in Australian dollars. Money, property that had to be approved for renovation, but they didn't understand or were not informed that this was the young boy's childhood home. Angus and George Malcolm, the location where the first riff sounded, AC/DC was born. A legend emerges from the living room. Was imagined using flickering amplifiers and the aspirations of Scottish immigrants' boys. That house had been part of the family's history. Noted it formerly had a memorial plaque. It used to be a place of pilgrimage for fans who traveled from all around the world to imagine this as you stand in front of it. The birthplace of Australian rock and roll, however, because of a series of administrative mistakes, the historical significance of the new owner never received the property. Proprietors, and so it was one June morning. Bulldozer crushed when the news broke, leaving Australia in disbelief. Fans of AC/DC voiced their voices in thousands. Protesting journalists, historians, and artists alike voiced their indignation and anguish. Angus Young remained silent. Stayed quiet as usual, maybe to him that house had been in the past for a long time. However, to all those who were raised with his guitar's sound was inaudible. Landmark in their recollections and its devastation, even if it is unintended, as if the soul of rock and roll had been discovered and broken in the midst of an uncaring city. Legacy doesn't always disappear in a loud explosion, it vanishes silently. And perhaps the only one who actually hears it is Angus Young. Angus's professional path. Young. When Malcolm Young inquired in 1973 at the age of 18, his younger brother, Angus, to start a group called the Alternate Current, abbreviation AC/DC. They didn't think they were starting one of the wildest, longest, and rock's most uncompromising travels. Angus started playing music in the past. Naturally, without any official instruction, no plan, he simply brought a few items. Wore a schoolboy uniform and a Gibson SG. Body that is connected to a high-voltage line and an intensity that even he was unable to describe at the time. Other artists were attempting to discover their style. Angus made no decisions. Only remained loyal to himself and something nature turned into a symbol. Originally, AC/DC was a real bar band. Shouting while playing in the middle of beer, and in that confusion, there were flying bottles. That Angus created his renowned stage style, the continual frenzied duck walk, knees hopping and head thumping to every riff, similar to a controlled sound seizure when high voltage, published by AC/DC in 1975, and Let There Is Rock. Angus was a livewire in 1977. Stage presence, but behind the craziness had an extremely well-organized intellect. He and Malcolm was in charge of each riff structure. Every beat, every musical development. Angus was more than just his stage persona. Was the foundation of the music. When Bon Scott passed away in 1980, everything appeared to be on the brink of collapse, but in that exact when Angus transcended the function of the vivacious younger brother and turned into the band's primary inspiration. With Malcolm co-authored the book Back in Black. Not merely a musical farewell to Bon, Peak was never able to fully reproduce the opening. Back in Black's riff is an enduring legacy. It reverberates at weddings, festivals, and stadiums. Films, fights, burials, and the man, the author, was simply 25 between the 1980s and the 2000s. As Angus, musical styles changed constantly. Young continued to wear the same outfit, delivering riffs while playing the same guitar that appeared outdated yet consistently provided the updated AC/DC Goosebumps generation, published for those who are going to rock the edge. Ball of Razor. Even in 2020, Breaker Stiff Upper Lip Power Up is a Malcolm-focused album. Dementia claimed the life of the oldest brother. The entire trip, AC/DC went via lineup changes, scandals, and important dismissals and huge returns, but Angus didn't alter to remain current. Not to please the public, not to conceal. Angus Young is a living example of aging, that becoming someone is not necessary otherwise, you just must be. Angus Young never gives you enough time. Attempting to become a legend, he just did one item, continued to play in the same manner. Donning identical attire and directing the same inner cry for 50 years. As technology advanced, the globe evolved. Angus held as even his own band altered. He never sped, sticking to the natural rhythm. Up, never lost it, and never strayed away. Never mentioned loneliness, yet you observed it in the manner in which he bowed his at every performance, stand in front of the amplifier. You could cry on stage, but he never did. In the thumping opening, hear that anguish. He never made a thunderstruck riff. Shiny grand declarations were never sought. His life story was never shared on talk by awards. Demonstrates, but he remained there during each time. AC/DC almost failed due to the friendship funerals at every stage. The world believed that he couldn't continue, and afterward, he returned to the street wearing the putting on the same old uniform, familiar SG. Just one word is required. Angus Young isn't a rock and roll star. The carrier of the flame, he is the current that never leaves.